This is Anna Scanlan here of the IBEC Hub, and I'm very pleased to have in the podcast suite with me today Fiona Fennell. Fiona, I think it would be nice if you introduced yourself.
Thanks, Anna. My name is Fiona Fennell. I'm the Network Manager for the Engineering Skillnet. That's one of 70 Skillnets in the country. And our job is to help with workforce development and support learners, hopefully on their lifelong learning journeys.
Very good. I think we've actually quite a similar interest. So I was looking at your background. I'm currently working with lecturers who are dealing with the pharma and science industry. And it turns out you have experience in that domain as well.
Yeah, to reverse engineer a small bit from my current job, I was actually the critical thinking trainer for the Engineering Skillnet. And where I received, I suppose, my own education in order to understand the importance of critical thinking, in fact, how crucial it is to industry, was where I worked as a soft skills coach for engineers and scientists who were being purpose trained to work in validation, which is, I suppose, a subset of quality assurance for the pharmaceutical and medtech sectors. So that was a really interesting experience. We worked with mixed cohorts of students, typically 8 to 10 within a group. And they were mixed from the point of view of backgrounds. Some were science graduates, others were very experienced engineers, but maybe from other sectors. And by supporting those groups through what was really like a 3-month boot camp, in a similar type of centre to this, in that we had an oral solid dose lab where people could actually see some of the processes around fluid bed granulation, etc. And people could get hands-on with lab equipment. And, they started with maybe a simple validating of a weighing machine within the lab. They could, combine quite a multidimensional learning experience in the same way that you do here, but maybe we didn't have quite the high-tech kit that you have. I'm jealous visiting today.
That's really interesting now, because it wouldn't be that common to take people from lots of different disciplines and funnel them through one course. Like, that's very challenging. How do you take someone from one discipline and mix them with a bunch of others from other disciplines?
I suppose the importance of it, the reason we did it was because needs must. And as you know, there's a talent shortage in the country, and the shortage was in the area of validation. And it's one where I suppose a lot of people in industry would have said before this course existed, you really can't learn about validation unless you do validation. But in fact, the experiential learning within a simulated setting is highly valuable. And it's a safe to fail place where you can do the most valuable thing of all, which is learn by mistakes. Within learning, I suppose within the world of learning and education, we've learned a lot, and we've learned that some of the principles that we held dear as, fundamental to learning were actually incorrect. We know now that people learn in loads of different ways. Academic learning is one very narrow piece. And actually, when people are given the opportunity to learn experientially, often it's a much richer and more durable experience.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And I think that has really informed the approaches in the IBEC Hub. We are kind of taking students from a science background predominantly, but we do open the door to students who have a science leaning and try and bring them through that experiential route. And it is possible. So we're finding out very possible and very welcome in industry as well. Because I suppose there would be nothing taught about science students going into a lab and learning the technical skills, but there seems to be less interest in how students might develop communication skills. And communication is part of everyone's experience. So maybe we take it for granted. It's not something maybe that academia does very well. And I think that's being reflected by industry, what they're looking for.
Yeah, listen, every environment has its limitations, and it can be a great strength to know the limitations, because that's what you're managing in a quality assurance and validation sense, is you're managing the critical parameters. And now, I suppose, if we look at learning itself, we know, okay, people have limitations we didn't really understand fully before. We thought, for example, that principles like the magical number 7, that we can, maintain in our working memory 7 distinct pieces of data. We know that that's actually not true. It's the magical number 1 plus or minus 1, or sorry, 3 plus or minus 1.
As bad as that.
It's a lot less than 7. And, in a way, if we throw too much information at anyone, be it in education or in industry, we're really creating a situation where they can't learn as effectively as they might. What we found on the course, and where I developed the interest in critical thinking, was the fact that we had great technical skills actually within the cohorts, and we had great scientific knowledge. And these were what we call, I suppose, technical skills. But the difference really when we produce a validation engineer or validation scientist is often, what makes the difference is their transversal skills.
Yes.
So these are your communication skills, your critical thinking capacity, your ability to collaborate with other people. And, in a way, we define not just learning, but intelligence too narrowly, because intelligence really is how intelligent your actions are when you meet with a situation you haven't seen before. Your
problem solving,
exactly.
Yeah, and your ability to transfer knowledge to new situations. Yeah.
Exactly. So, industry is asking a lot of people, I think, because more and more we're dealing with an abstract and complex world in industry. And there are high stakes decisions that we expect people to make. And often these are once-off decisions. So actually we need to create much safer spaces for people to learn. And that's another, I think, something I learned about learning is, there's a bit of a false dichotomy when we talk about nature versus nurture. We don't separate the two. The space and the environment of learning is really dictating a huge amount of what anybody learns. Yeah. And you're creating here a really safe space to fail. You're creating something that's very valuable for industry, which is for people to understand at the end of the day, when there's a patient at the end of the line, it's, our multidisciplinary inputs and our ability to communicate across other disciplines that really comes to the fore if we're to manage the risk for a patient. And they're skills we can learn. So we shouldn't label ourselves and limit ourselves that, I'm an introvert or I'm shy. I won't be able to contribute as much as somebody else. Everyone has something unique to contribute. And the more complex the problems are, the more all those unique perspectives really, really matter.
Actually, you hit on something very important there. And I suppose you have students coming from whatever discipline they're after graduating from, and they're going into whatever industry, say science, medtech, and all of a sudden what they have learned for 4 years or 5 years may not reflect the actual workplace, and they might be an A+ student academically and with their technical skills, but if they can't communicate effectively, or if they're not good to collaborate, or never had the opportunity to do much teamwork or do case studies where they might have to assess risk or anything like that, it can be very difficult for them to transition into the workplace. They can feel lost very, very quickly. And I know you have an interest in looking at how the mind works there. We have a shared interest in the brain and learning and how to increase that confidence.
Yes, and I think, I'd like to give people a bit of good news on that front. Well, I'll start with the bad news, maybe. The bad news is we're all not as rational as we would like to think we are, because we're all social animals first. Yeah. Okay, so no matter how great we think we are at reasoning, any of us, it doesn't matter if we're an expert and have 20 years of experience in industry or we're an acolyte or new to industry. We're social beings, and we operate much better and we perform much better when we allow that aspect of ourselves to realize itself. And it takes the pressure off the individual then a little bit. We don't need to know who we are and what our individual value proposition is necessarily, because who we become is in relation to other people. And that's in the workforce, that's at home, that's, in your own social circles. But the good news is for all of us, we have 3 killer apps where human intelligence is still superior to artificial intelligence. And if we can make the right spaces, and if we can have the confidence in ourselves that these are the real skills we are practicing and need to, not master, but become better at in small ways every day, they are, first of all, what's called inquiry. So, generative AI, it can't inquire of itself. It's not able to just generate its own questions. We're good at generating and inquiring and using a scientific method. So if you're a scientist and maybe you've no industry experience, you still bring a lot of value into industry because you bring a scientific method. So you are more open to going, well, that could be the case, but maybe let's not take that at face value. Is there a controlled experiment we could do? How can we, maybe get to can we make sure that data or fact really reflects reality? So asking the right questions and realizing, even if you aren't, somebody who's very socially confident, you can be skilled in Socratic questioning, for example. So it's, you learn, there are actually maybe 8 types of different questions. You can question assumptions, you can question concepts, you can ask for examples, you can question, implications of something. So you can train yourself to ask good quality questions. And then you are using your intelligence and applying that well. The next one is dialogue. we're used to, I suppose, the idea that we should discuss points, and we should. And that in a way is scientific, because it means to break points down. And, being analytical is useful for either an engineer or a scientist. But dialogue goes beyond that, and it goes towards, I suppose, I'm coming with one set of understandings or one set of domain expertise. You're coming with maybe a different set of knowledge. How do we meet together in a way and create a flow of meaning between us that gives us a third perspective on a situation? So it's like that Sufi metaphor of the blind men examining the elephant. We're all going to find something slightly different because we're at different angles to a problem or an elephant. But it's by putting all that information together, we can go, oh, hang on, I can characterize what I'm dealing with here. As you said, it's problem solving needs multiple perspectives. And actually a beginner's mind of a student coming in with no industry experience can often be highly valuable because you've no preconceptions. So you might ask you think it might even be a silly question. Why is that pipe there? Why not over there? And an experienced engineer might say, oh, hang on, that's a good point. We only did that in the first place because it facilitated that product. We don't really have to worry about that anymore. And if we just reorganize the layout slightly, we'll get this level of improvement on our process. So a beginner's mind is really, really valuable. So coming with a good set of questioning techniques that can be learned, and then being willing to talk to other people and ask questions, but listen to what's been said. And active listening is listening to maybe what's not been said. Yes. And that includes asking questions and being confident enough to engage with experts, because experts also need to be questioned. And often what you'll find is they won't give you definitive answers. But then you can ask the question, well, what information would you need for you to give me a definitive answer? Yes. So a beginner's mind is, just a scientific method and a curiosity is very, very useful. But then I suppose even, curiosity, you can have too much of it. So you have to also know, well, when do I step aside from this situation or this period of time that I've been learning, and when do I do something else that human intelligence can do that artificial intelligence can't, and that's reflect upon itself. Because we don't always learn all the valuable lessons in real time, and we don't always realize the value of what we've learned until we reflect. So I would encourage people to every 3 months or every week or whatever their, the cycle time that suits them, to go back and say, okay, what did I learn this week? Okay, am I sure what I learned is actually correct? Have I a peer who I could bounce this off? It doesn't have to even necessarily appear in the same factory as you. So when we sent our cohorts out to work in validation in industry, what we'd encourage them to do is chat to your peers every few weeks. If you're both, for instance, maybe you're both working on a vial filling line and you've learned how to execute some standard operating procedures on some kind of test, or, even if it's something as simple as you're doing visual inspection of autoclaves, ask each other what you think you've learned. And what you'll discover is, oh, hang on, we do it slightly differently in these 2 different places. I wonder why that is. Why is that the validated procedure? How does that fit in with the bigger picture of maybe a validation master plan? So it's by us, as peers learning from each other, and we learn most of the valuable things.
And it's true, but I think it's culturally, it's a big, big problem in Ireland anyway. It's the fear of asking the question in case you're seen as being incompetent or somehow not knowing is the worst thing possible. You definitely see it amongst the students, but I am told that also persists into industry a little bit, unless you're quite senior in your job. There is a fear to question. So how do you overcome that? Now, what we're trying to do in our courses is to embed a very heavy element of communication and assignments involving communication or different scenarios. But at the end of the day, for a student going out into industry, they don't want to overdo it with the questions. True. They want to be able to ask the right questions. So would you think the first step of becoming an effective communicator might be to find that mentor?
Yeah, it's been willing to ask the questions when you mightn't want to hear the answers is one of your biggest career strengths. And you have managers that you want to learn from, and it's hard in the sense that they have so much to do. So one of the ways I would say is go back to your basics. We as scientists and engineers and any form of educators, we all share really in an intellectual heritage. And there are 9 standards that we're all trying to achieve. And the first 3 are very important in industry because that's where most of the mistakes get made. The first 3 are clarity, accuracy, and precision. So let's just use those three. The others are things like logic and significance and breadth and depth and fairness, etc. But even if we just focus on those three, if you write a document, it could be your first technical document, whatever it might happen to be, and you want honest feedback on it. One of the ways you could get that honest feedback is be brave enough to turn to a peer and say, would you mind reviewing that document for me? And that's a headache for them in a way because they don't have to do it. But if you're very precise and you say, listen, I just want you to review it from the point of view of clarity. Is it clear? You don't need to go to any of the detail and tell me why this is right or wrong, but just, is it clear or not clear to you before I submit this? That's invaluable feedback for you.
It's very common sense as well.
It is. Yeah, don't ask for too much. Yeah. Know when to ask for feedback. Be able to take it and learn from it because these are the learning opportunities that we sometimes miss. And a manager will gravitate also to people who know what they're asking for. They're trying to be all things to all people at times with, pressures on them. But when somebody knows which of those standards in my work am I trying to improve incrementally, bit by bit? Am I trying to have more precision about how I report on my experiments, or do I want to make sure that I'm getting most of the significant data there? I'm using a statistical tool, but is there anything I'm missing? Once you know what it is you're trying to improve of those 9 standards, then you're even more likely to improve it. Somebody else is going to say to you, well, listen, I'm wondering, would you help somebody else, for instance? And, I often found that we had graduates who were very capable, but they were underconfident actually for their level of capability.
Confidence is a huge thing.
So there's a gap there between confidence and competence. And, I remember one particular student and she was worried about going into industry. She had performed brilliantly in our, boot camp situation. And I couldn't believe it when she said, I'm not sure I'm ready. And I said, why? And she said, because I'm dyslexic. And I remember saying to her, wow, we'd never have noticed anything in your work to reflect that. But on the other hand, I said, maybe we should have, because you actually produced, and I could show her this a week later, I said, you produce less errors in what you submitted. And I said, because you've mastered a skill that the others haven't, which is you triple check your work. Right? Yeah. So, once she had kind of realized, okay, actually, you don't have to be perfect.
She was very
in fact, it helps,
oriented,
but because she knew she was capable of making mistakes, she always had the intellectual integrity of checking that. And the product was her work itself. That spoke very loudly for her, but she wasn't seeing it because she probably wasn't comparing herself to other people by their work. She was just comparing herself by something she saw was a weakness. But her work was actually what spoke best of her and did her justice. And I suppose, that's the other thing going into industry, that we should trust our own common sense more.
And do that's actually nice for students to hear who might have some kind of a disability, be it a learning or otherwise, that there is a place in industry, and not to rule yourself out, not to be the one to say no to yourself, not to put those blocks in front of you. The other thing then is where you have students that perform very well academically, say, and they get used to taking part in group activities and to speaking in front of the class, but then maybe fail in the interviews a little bit. Do you have any insight? I know you've worked so much in this area. Do you have any insight or tips to give to students that might be going into an interview in terms of their confidence and how they manage kind of questions in that arena?
Sure. I think, ultimately remember the person who's interviewing you, they want you to do well at interview as well. But they mightn't be looking for the type of confidence that you think they're looking for, because there's an outer confidence that somebody, might portray when they're asked what we call competency-based questions, they may not perform as well as they might otherwise perform. Because really, when we're interviewing for this sector, what we're most looking for is the inner confidence that you'll do the right thing when nobody's asking or looking at you doing it. And that's integrity. So I think some people think in an interview situation, it's performative. It's not the same as work. It is, in the sense that we want to see how you behave at work portrayed in the interview. So a very valuable thing, and I would guide people around this, is know what you know and know what you don't know. And don't be afraid to say, no, I don't know that. So, you might happen to have a HPLC piece of equipment on your CV and you only really got to use it once. But it's there because you did use it.
That's quite common.
That's exactly.
Quite common occurrence.
You're better off when they ask you a question about that particular piece of equipment going, I'll just be honest with you, I've only actually hands-on used that once. Yeah. Just be honest. And I suppose the other part of it is, they're recruiting the whole person. You don't come to work and leave your personality or your personal interest behind. And I remember one particular person getting stumped at interview because we asked them the question, tell us about when attention to detail was very important, for example. And they felt, I've no industry experience, I've no example to give. And they kind of passed on the question. But I noticed at the bottom of their CV that this person made crafts. And I said, oh, what crafts do you make? And they started telling us they made enamel jewellery. I said, oh, wow, there's a lot of different steps involved in that process. Which is the most important one? And they were able to pick out immediately, well, when you put the enamel into the furnace, this temperature has to be right. Yeah. You have to, this motion has to be right. I was able to immediately go, yes, okay, I can see this person working in a clean room, understanding the importance of there's a time and a place for doing things. You must do things in the right order. The respect for a craft was there. And, you know, a lot of what we're trying to do in industry is learn our craft. You know, your tools could be an Excel sheet one day, there could be a piece of instrumentation another day, and it could be your set of listening skills another day, but it's all part of your craft. And you may not always find that you're learning at the same pace all the time. You might find sometimes, God, I'm falling backwards in this now because I'm concentrating on that. Don't worry. Everybody is learning at a different pace, but you as a whole person you're integrative. You know, you will find that, you know, you are worth something because you have different interests. Yes, you blow hot and cold on this, that, or the other because you're actually a human being. And they're the people we're serving here are our patients. Yeah. They're human beings too. So to understand you're potentially flawed, yes, but also unique. They're the same as your patient. Yeah. So the more you have that inner, you know, knowledge as well, that you're able to be self-aware, but also give yourself a break sometimes, you know, not be thinking about 24/7 how you're coming across or your performance or what anyone else thinks.
Stop comparing yourself to others. And because everyone is bringing their own experience. Yeah. And everyone can learn if they're open to it.
Yeah, just compare yourself to yesterday. And if you have a bad day today, realize, okay, tomorrow I could learn something new. And then surround yourself with people who want to learn as well. And you even know a good expert from a inverted commas expert. A very good expert in any domain is somebody who can tell you when they most recently made a mistake and what they learned from that mistake.
That's really interesting. And do you know what we skipped over now? We never actually discussed Skillnet. Would you mind talking around that a bit?
Sure.
Because I'm not too sure what awareness there is out there around Skillnet.
Well, for us as an engineering Skillnet, 63% of our member companies are small, medium enterprises. They're dealing with the same challenges as the big companies are these days. They have a higher regulatory burden. They need to manage risk well. They need to be productive. They need to be able to compete and they need to innovate. So actually, they're like microcosms of big companies. So I often say to people, you know, early stage careers, you learn more in a small company in a way because in one sense more is expected of you. So you develop a broader set of skills. Not to say it isn't great to join graduate programs, it is, but small companies, you learn a huge amount as well. And what our engineering Skillnet is trying to do is to future-proof our workers, to understand what's coming ahead and how do we make safe spaces for people to learn and how do we give them learning tools that are appropriate and relevant for them. And nowadays we recognise people learn in all sorts of ways and there's all forms of learning are valuable. So we want to also not just upskill people and cross-skill people, but also recognise some of the skills that are there that we probably don't fully appreciate and then make sure those skills can be certified. So if somebody's been on a factory floor for 20 years, they've developed all sorts of different competencies and skills. And we want to also make sure that they're recognised from the point of view that we take experiential learning and, you know, we make lots of skills pathways open to them. There's no reason why somebody who's been working on a factory floor couldn't enter into a skills pathway by doing 3 or 4 modules in automation and find in 6 years' time, oh, wow, I'm a qualified engineer. How did that happen? And actually, they don't have to always know their purpose ahead of time. In bite-sized chunks, you actually get there. So on our steering group, there are representatives from industry. We have a carpenter. And he then went to worked in a joinery, became a project manager, then got interested in, you know, how to make tasks more efficient and improve processes, found himself in medical device sector, became a technician then on the line, and then slowly but surely built around using, you know, stacking up all the different modules he had done. And now he's an automation controls manager doing a master's.
There you go. That's fantastic because I think you said something earlier as well. You said it's important not to label ourselves. Because actually you narrow yourself as well. You limit yourself if you always perceived yourself to be, say, an artist, for example, and nothing else. And if it doesn't work out for you, you could get very hung up on that or that you're a failure somehow. Whereas a growth mindset would open you up to new possibilities and not limiting yourself to be one thing or another. So I think that's important as well, is looking at other people's journeys who have, in your, say, eyes, become successful. Say maybe they're a leader now or maybe their supervisor, just like the example you gave. I think it would be very rare to find someone who went straight from their degree to work in that narrow little focus of their degree for their entire career. And often the most successful people are those who have been able to kind of zigzag through different roles and and they've picked up different competencies along the way.
I mean, they're what we characterise now as non-linear careers. But the reality is there has to be more of them now, because AI is going to help us identify new molecules. So suddenly we're going to have whole new domains of knowledge that we need people to be able to cross, skill over to those domains and connect up the dots between them. It might surprise a lot of graduates to know, there are directors of engineering who didn't do the Leaving Cert in Ireland, went to Germany, became apprentices, found their way back to Ireland later, down in their careers. And, not everyone has to follow the same path. You're not a failure if you're not promoted every 2 years. There you go.
The Leaving Cert is not to be all and end all.
No,
there is
certainly not.
The Leaving Cert.
That's the great thing about Ireland at the moment. It's almost, that we've almost too much choice about learning.
Yeah.
But, we need that because, and I mean that in the sense that the type of diversity we most need in companies, all the rest of the diversity is fantastic. We do want representational diversity, don't get me wrong. But the thing we most need is cognitive diversity. So we can come at problems from different angles because we'll need to do that. And when I talk to managers about, is there anything missing from a competency point of view? They'll say, we need more people who can join the dots and we need more people who can think outside the box. Well, what that is really just spotting unlikely connections. The broader your base of knowledge is and the more range of interests you have, the more likely it is that you will spot those unlikely connections and just ask a question somebody else mightn't have thought of. So it's wonderful to see now people are having longer careers. They're often having second careers. They're following dual paths. There's nothing wrong with going and leaving industry for 6 months and going off and doing something totally different and coming back.
And I think there is a better culture developing for lifelong learning and a lot more support. And I know there's movements being made towards recognition of prior learning as well. But where do you see that improvement is needed maybe between universities and Skillnet or industry and Skillnet? How could we work better together?
Well, I think engagement, dialogue, being willing to have different opinions like we did today.
Yes,
we said lots of different opinions. So debate is good because in a way, that's what the scientific method is about as well. And that's what critical thinking about. It's like taking both sides of an argument yourself. If you can argue the opposite side of an argument that you don't, it's not your opinion, but you can argue it just as well, then you are coming at, then you're coming at things in a well-rounded, holistic way. So that's what we need is more debate, more dialogue, people willing to, I suppose, innovate. And that's not easy to do, sometimes for structural reasons, sometimes because we're time poor. But there isn't really any excuse now because the technology will do so much for us. So we actually now need to decide, okay, what is this technology about? Do we want a future? Do we want to define the future based on what we can do with technology, or do we define the future based on what technology can do for us? Yeah. And that makes us ask some very challenging questions. We call it human-centric manufacturing in industry, but we're not being very human-friendly at the moment in some of the practices and some of the maybe ways we're applying technology right now. So we have a bit of a corrective action to do maybe, to make sure that we're creating learning environments and social environments that are kind to humans. And, that means protecting people's cognitive well-being. So those three processes, if I go back to those, Anna, for a second, creating spaces where it's safe to ask questions, where you're not labelled because you didn't have the same opinion as everyone else. Creating spaces where people who have very diverse opinions are willing to sit down and listen to each other.
I think that's actually a big problem at the moment, kind of socially, is that people are afraid to offend. And if you offend, whether you mean to or not, it's seen as an aggression. And in reality, you have to be able to tease things out, and not everyone is going to agree, and you have to not be afraid of someone not sharing the same opinion as you, whether that's in education or life.
Yeah, we have to learn how to argue well.
We do.
And
we've lost the ability to argue.
Yeah, that's important. Yeah. I mean, there were days where engineers in college were trained on something called rhetoric. And these days, rhetoric is a dirty word, but really rhetoric is important because, the art of rhetoric is the art of influencing. And we need to be able to influence without authority and without moralizing and without judging other people. And that's becoming a bit rare. So I suppose the third piece then is that our cognitive, killer app of reflection. I agree with you. Sometimes in industry, we're so hard pressed to get the job done. If it's a new product introduction or if it's, a process improvement, whatever, we're trying to better all the times. But that can mean that we lose out on valuable learning opportunities. So it's easier to manage if you have one set of people working on this product, another set of people working on that product. But then you miss out the learning opportunities of, okay, what did you learn on those projects that we should now do in these projects? We don't always create that space for shared reflection. And it's now about making some safe spaces and prioritizing that so that we all can learn at every level, because there's leaders everywhere in organizations. The title is irrelevant from my point of view. Risk is everywhere. So we need leaders everywhere. We need people who are willing to take responsibility and accountability and want to work together. So 3 questions we're all really asking ourselves, if we're honest, every day is, first of all, am I good enough? Secondly, do I belong here? And the third one is, am I able for the next challenge?
Yeah.
And it's to realize our employees are asking those questions of themselves every day and making sure that we create safe spaces that they're answering, yeah, you are good enough. That's a given because you're here and you're not perfect. And there are bits of skills you need to develop and others that, are at a very high standard. But that's all good too, because we can all learn from each other as we're learning. And then the second one, do I belong here? That's up to ourselves to understand, what are we really doing this for? And who do we identify most with? And the reality is, and UCC studies have backed this up, is we identify most with the group we identify most with at the time, because they're who influence our decisions most. So we need to, look at that and say, what does our group represent? Does it represent a critical thinking culture in itself? If it doesn't, we have to work on that. And then I suppose thirdly, are we up for the next challenge? We have so many more tools now to both improve education and improve the quality of our lives. We've heaps of potential. And we don't have to always limit ourselves based on the belief that learning is X, but it's not Y, or training is X, or it's not Y. Fundamentally, we innately are designed to learn. So the more we can realize we're not going to outrun our own biology, respect our biological limits, and understand that it's socially we're at our strongest, and support social learning and peer-to-peer learning and communities of practice, the more that we can support ourselves to solve the wicked problems, as they call them, that are ahead of us, where they're not that well defined.
What is a wicked problem?
So that comes from a chap called Hogarth, and he just differentiated between, I suppose, kind learning environments and wicked learning environments. And a wicked learning environment is where things it's not always a straightforward cause-effect relationship, because the feedback loops might be slow or fuzzy in some way. And we need feedback loops to learn. That's why we like repeated patterns. And in kind learning environments where everything is very straightforward and well set out for us and it repeats at a regular cycle, we learn well. But in more wicked environments that are more abstract and maybe the beginning of one thing is the end of another, you've interrelated systems, you've interdependent, groups of people, it's just harder to learn. So we need to put some scaffolding in place then. And, environments like this are great opportunities to do that.
Talking about environments, it was lovely having you here today, and you were here with a colleague as well, Michelle Quinn, as part of a walking tour of the IED Hub, and you were shown different immersive spaces we're using. So I suppose we're trying to challenge that notion of being risk averse. We are taking risks. Now, we have been facilitated very much in doing so by funding we received from the HCI Pillar 3 grant, and it has allowed us to take the time to try out different innovative education technologies, but also to try out different kind of approaches. Maybe some are more wicked than kind, maybe some are more kind than wicked. We've tried to bring in real world scenarios to challenge the students, what they might face, say, in an audit or an interview or whatever. And having seen some of our facilities now today, is there anything that stands out at you as being particularly unique to us or of great potential?
I suppose one of the things I like is, Anna, you've challenged some of what we would consider, maybe they're almost myths about learning. And one of those is that it takes 10,000 hours of practice to master a skill. And that isn't actually correct. It's the number of iterations within which we can make a mistake and learn from that mistake. And you've created a really good setting for that. And it is real world because, I've seen the examples of, for instance, you've a patient there, you're having to ring to get this information from one place, something unexpected happens, And I think the more that we can realise, industry is full of unexpected things as well. It's not straightforward. There are different competing pressures on people. There are really exciting challenges, but it's okay sometimes to rest on your common sense, improvise, work with other people to figure things out. It's all about figuring things out. Problems won't come necessarily always well defined for you, but the joy of working with other people is that you bring out the best in one another and you also support each other. So this is also a supportive learning environment. And it's a great way to, I suppose, give a model to people of, okay, I now know what helps me learn best. I want the concrete example of doing this, but I also want the abstract concepts explained to me in this way that's very visual. I want to be able to reflect on it with my peers. And, it kind of starts to complete a learning circle for people. And we need to realise we don't always complete the circles.
And I think it's actually about giving the example in a very real world way, so that if you face that or anything similar, that you're not caught completely blindsided. And I don't think it's something always that education does very well. So it's something I'm very happy is a positive element of what we do here. So there is academic writing, of course there is reports to be wrote, but it also includes likes of CAPA reports and things like that, writing up, the ability to write up an SOP and to understand it, exposing students to P and ID drawings, stuff that they will actually need to use. Yes, you have to cover some of the foundational concepts, but not overburdening on the foundational. Get them practicing, get them learning as they go, and definitely learning from peers. And I think, say we have the VR headsets, we have our immersive suite. It's like walking into the holodeck of the old Star Trek. And we have this podcast suite, which we're now repurposing for our own use here. But it invites a different kind of collaboration with each technology. So I suppose it's about exploring where you might excel that you would never have dreamed you could. And like that, going back to the confidence that some students may have or some industry folk may have over another. If you never challenge yourself, how do you know what you might achieve,
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose in a way, we're all guilty of staying in our comfort zone. Mm-hmm. Once we think we might be good at one thing, we'd like to ride that out for as long as possible and, gain as much reward for it. But technology isn't going to allow us to do that for much longer. We have something called the half-life of knowledge. So people working in information technology, they've been dealing with this a long time, which is, every 5 years, half of what they know is out of date. Now it's more like every 2 years. But the technology is there to serve us, not the other way around. And I suppose that's one part of a situation like this is you start to see the value of the technology. They can amplify what are our innate skills anyway. So you and I are having a conversation. We happen to be in and recording this as a podcast situation, but we're learning from each other in the thrust of the conversation. We're also realizing I actually am clear on what my rationale is for what I do because you're drawing it out of me. In fact, that's all an auditor is expecting of us either. An auditor doesn't expect that you make no mistakes. An auditor just wants to know, well, if you did make a mistake, at least you made it based on a consistent logic that you had applied before and you can explain it.
You had thought through the process.
Exactly.
Yeah,
now, you might not know the ins and outs of every microbe or, biocontaminant or biocompatibility. You might be an engineer being interviewed by an auditor. But ultimately, if you know the rationale behind why it was done that way and that's consistent, the auditor sees, okay, hang on, I can see now they're being consistent. So you can do the wrong thing, but for the right reasons. And an auditor will look much more kindly on that than if you're doing some of the right things, but you can't explain the reasons for them.
Yeah, and I suppose part of that is back to the very start, we're cycling back, is the ability to communicate and be able to ask questions of others in the first place so that if you are unsure of anything, you know who to go to get your answers. I have really pushed you outside your comfort zone today, Fiona. I really caught you on the hop and pulled you in here. So I'm really grateful that you took the time out to come in and sit down with me and be scrutinised on so many different levels. But I have learned a huge amount from it and I'm really grateful.
Well, it's been really enjoyable day. You've been very gracious host. Thank you.